mic? Thank you, Australia. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank all of you who showed up on time, and thank all those of you who are online who are also viewing. This is part of a series we call Grand Challenges and Opportunities. And we organized this several years ago because we think there are certain topics, certain themes that regardless of what you do in our school, and I would say in education generally, these are issues that you should be thinking about, informed about, and prepared to engage in some hopefully educated and intelligent discourse on. And so the theme this year is democracy and education. And can't imagine a more timely topic than this one, given the state of our country. I'm Pedro Noguera. I'm the Dean of the Rossier School. I want to thank the organizers, Pat Toby. Paula, I'm calling you Pat, I'm sorry, Paul. Athenius Ocampo, and who was the third? Corinne Hyde. Thank you all for your work in pulling these together. This is the second to last in the series. I'll let my colleague here, Rob Philbeck, introduce the panel. The last one, just to give you a heads up, is with our newly installed president, Sue Kim, and that'll be in, 3 weeks? 2. March 11th, thank you. So stay tuned. But it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Philbeck.
Great, thank you, Pedro. I think I'm mic'd here, good. Welcome, everyone. I also want to thank you all for coming here and for those of you that are attending online. As Pedro said, I'm Rob Philbeck. I'm a professor of clinical education in the Rossier School, and I'm also co-coordinator with my colleague Jen Crawford of the Rossier Democracy Project. And it's just a real pleasure to be moderating today. My role here is just to keep us on time, keep the good questions flowing, and I'm really looking forward to it. Just a quick rundown. We're going to start in a moment here. I'll introduce our esteemed panel, and then they're each going to give about a 5 to 8 minute presentation on their work related to our topic tonight. I'm going to then pose some questions to them, but then I'm looking forward to turning it over to you, and we'll have mics at some point where you can also ask some questions. So I encourage you to listen tonight, thinking about the kind of questions that you'd like to ask, what's making you curious. So we look forward to that. And then we'll be sure to end with a few minutes at the end to get some final thoughts from our panelists. Before I introduce them, I just want to say a couple of remarks about our theme, just to help frame our session together. So our title is Building Otherwise Organizations and Schools as a Site of Collective Life. So let's just unpack that for a moment. Schools and colleges and many other organizations, especially those that involve education and learning, are not just closed systems cut off from society. They're not neutral, where things are just learned and skills are just acquired. So that's important for us to think about. Instead, they are part of society's effort and really need to reproduce itself, to transmit its culture, its values from one generation to the next. So this is where it gets interesting. That's why education and schools are so contested. If you think about the content of education, even the process of education, it's often contested because whether implicitly or explicitly, we know that these institutions are playing a central role in the preservation and sometimes transformation of society. So a key part of society is politics, how we participate, how we have discourse, how we make decisions, how we govern ourselves, who counts and whose voice counts. And so if we describe our political system as a democracy, then, and if we want to sustain that democracy in a way that sustains deep democracy, not just an illusion of democracy, then more is required than just transmitting information, than just learning about democracy. It requires cultivating certain things, across all ages, certain norms and practices. So today, we are asking our panelists, and we're going to engage with them around questions like, how does the collective life in our schools and other organizations strengthen the skills that are required for democracy? How might practices within our organizations narrow or limit democratic possibility? And ultimately, how can we help our organizations function more productively as laboratories for democracy? I'm very confident that our panelists will be able to help us think about this and give us better pictures of what this looks like based on their work. And with that, let me introduce them. I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to present. So Mindy Romero is founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, which is part of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy. Mindy is based in Sacramento. Professor Romero is a political sociologist, holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis. Mindy's research focuses on political behavior and race ethnicity, and in her work, she seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the US. Welcome, Mindy. John Pascarella is a professor of clinical education in the USC Rossier School of Education. He's also chief academic officer in the USC Race and Equity Center and an elected board member of the California Council on Teacher Education. As a nationally recognized expert in racial equity and teacher education, John has published more than 24 scholarly articles, authored a number of widely read op-eds, and delivered over 150 invited talks on ways to advance equity-driven change across P-12 schools and in higher education institutions and nonprofit orgs. Before joining USC, John taught high school English in urban New Jersey, held faculty appointments at Montclair State University and McGill, and served as a visiting researcher at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. And Bob Schrum, our final panelist tonight, is the Carmen H. and Louis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics at USC Dornsife and the director of the Center for the Political Future. Bob is a legendary political democratic strategist with a long and impressive career. He was a speechwriter for 2 presidential campaigns, Senator George McGovern's race in 1972 and Senator Edward Kennedy's in 1980. He also went on to serve as Senator Kennedy's press secretary and political strategist in the early 1980s. He was the strategist in over 25 other winning U.S. Senate campaigns. His clients included Joe Biden, John Glenn, and Barbara Mikulski, as well as John Kerry and Al Gore in their presidential races. Overseas, he's had clients that have included Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the British Labour Party, the Prime Minister of Ireland, and the presidents of Colombia and Bolivia. In his academic role here at USC, Professor Schrum teaches courses at USC on domestic policy, applied politics, and elections. But he has also taught at NYU and held fellowships at Yale and Harvard. His 2007 book, No Excuses, Concessions of a Serial Campaigner, was a national bestseller, and his writings have appeared across major venues like the New York Times, New York Magazine, Los Angeles Times, Huffington Post, and so on. He's also had regular columns in Slate, The Week, and The Daily Beast. Welcome to Mindy, John, and Bob. We're going to turn now to their presentations, and with that, I'm going to turn it first over to Mindy.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? All right. Can we say good evening? No, we're not 5 o'clock yet. Well, good afternoon and soon to be good evening. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to see if this, there we go. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about actually 2 elements of my work. First and foremost, my Center for Inclusive Democracy, which as you know is at the Price School of Public Policy. And then I'll spend a little bit of time, just a little bit, talking about a new initiative that I've helped found called By the People, for the People. But let's first talk about the Center for Inclusive Democracy. You can, and after I tell you kind of what it is and what we do and the reach, I'm going to tell you why we do it, which I think is even more important. So our mission is all about outcomes, improving the social, economic quality of life, essentially, of communities. We think that civic engagement, political participation, civic engagement more broadly is intimately interconnected, right, with a whole host of social and economic outcomes. And we are a nonpartisan, academic-based research center but we very much are also an applied research center. So we want our research, right, as stated up front in our mission, to inform efforts aimed at both increasing participation but also representation. Again, nonpartisan in that work. It's not just political, but also civic more broadly. All sorts of different ways in our big, beautiful democracy that people can participate, have their voice heard, and get their needs met, right? And in this work, we work with policymakers, we work with election officials, elected officials certainly, and we work also a lot with community groups, nonpartisan community groups, or even statewide or national. We're a national research center. We started off primarily initially in California. We used to be called the California Civic Engagement Project, and then shortly after moving here to USC, we became the Center for Inclusive Democracy. We were at UC Davis for almost 8 years and now have been at USC for 8 years. So we've been around a little over 15 years. So we're tried and true in terms of the relationships and the kind of reach and the understanding and the trust around our research. So we do research in the democracy space, particularly, but not only, but particularly in elections, voting behavior, the voter experience, understanding patterns of participation, why people participate, why people don't participate. Very much why people don't participate, because we don't spend enough time talking about that and how disconnected people feel and the reasons for that, the real barriers, both institutional barriers, but also attitudinal barriers, as we like to think about, but not apathy, right? Real reasons why people don't participate, because people do care about their communities. And in that work, we ask community groups, policymakers, and others to help inform our work. So we want to make sure that our research, or the research questions that we follow, are actually grounded in what is useful for communities and policymakers. Lots of things that we could, right, embark on, lots of studies that we could do that would satisfy us, but we want to make sure that the research is actually useful on the ground. And because of that, because of the relationships and because of the reach of our work and because of the focus of our work, our research has informed dozens of bills across the country and I think 24 here in California in different sorts of ways. Again, we never take a position on the bill, right? But the work, right, gets utilized in all sorts of different ways, right? Sometimes by pros and cons of the same bill, even, which is always interesting. And we also communicate our work very widely. We disseminate our research. We do op-eds across the country regularly in many national outlets as well, and we have relationships with thought leaders across the country, either informing our work or us informing their work, lots of partnerships. Some of our data tools, so we do research and research reports, but some of our data tools are national in scope, help inform the work of election officials and community groups to help increase participation, equitable representation, and some of those data tools are actually written into state law in a couple of different states across the country. How much time do I have?
Another 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so why did we start the center? I'm the founder. I founded it when I was at UC Davis, actually finishing up my graduate program. Don't ask how a graduate student starts a research center. That's a whole nother story. But it essentially, and I think this is important, my center wasn't started by a university school, right, a school, or by a committee. All great when centers are started that way, and those also usually come with a lot of resources, right, and thinking around that. But it was founded because I saw a gap in the field. I saw our field in California and nationally not talking very much about disparities in participation by race, by age, by ethnicity, by urban, rural, by disability status, all sorts of ways. I emphasize race and ethnicity in the bio, but all sorts of ways that we look at patterns of participation. Wasn't discussed very much. There wasn't very much data, or at least not accessible data in accessible forms and research reports and two-pagers, right, from trusted academic sources that were also usable and digestible for ledge staff, and also all the way down to very small community groups that never normally have access to data, and hey, they have access to data, right, and researchers that are wanting to engage with them to make sure that they understand the work. That's really fundamental to who we are, and the work has grown tremendously, like from day one. because there wasn't a lot of other people doing this sort of work. And sadly so, I have great colleagues across the country in academia and different, we partner with many scholars across the country, but still accessible research, right, in the democracy space, and it gets lots of subdivisions within that. Still, it's still harder to find work that is actually accessible and really geared to, and really disseminated widely, right, to inform questions in a nonpartisan, trusted way. So that's why we started this research. I started the center, and then just really quickly, so you can get the website for Center for Inclusive Democracy, obviously at USC. There's another initiative that has been based here at USC, but it really is much broader than any one school or university. It is eventually going to be everyone, and it's called By the People, For the People. And I found it with a colleague over at SNF Agora at Johns Hopkins University, Scott Warren, and now we have many, many organizations and institutions as a part of this. If you are interested, that's the URL, but what this initiative is about is reimagining U.S. democracy, recognizing that all of the data that so many of us in the field in the democracy space have collected and reported on, researched and reported on, tell us that the numbers are probably not going to change a whole lot if we really are honest with each other, because of the degree of disconnect that Americans feel from their democracy, because their democracy really isn't working for them, right? Voting is important no matter what, but people often struggle to see why their vote matters, why their participation matters. They struggle to see outcomes that they can actually tie, right? And feel that they get a fair shot, or even amongst the most wonderful, dedicated election or elected officials, we'll hear them say that they struggle to serve their communities and their constituents in ways that they want to, right? Because of a system that has many, many barriers, right, to accurately, right, represent people. So this initiative is about that. You can click on did I say URL? QR code. I do know the difference, and get the URL. And you can learn more about it if you're interested. But this is something, again, growing much beyond the university, although Price School and the USC has been enormously supportive of the initiative thus far, and I greatly appreciate that. I hope I was at 8 minutes. There you go.
I think so. Good. Thank you, Mindy. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
All right. So I wasn't planning to talk as much about the center, but now I feel obligated to.
Please.
The USC Race and Equity Center is a center that was founded 15 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania by Sean Harper, who's a university professor here and is a founding and executive director of the center up until last year, at what point Dr. Jessica DeGore-Gumby took over as executive director, and Sean has stayed on as the chief research scientist. Our work at the Race and Equity Center spans three portfolios. The work we do in K-12 schools and districts and school communities, which is the work that I lead. Colleges and universities, community colleges and other institutions of higher education, and nonprofit industry and other companies that are looking to advance equity work. And through the last 6 years of my work at the center, I've been thinking a lot about my role as a teacher educator for the last 2 decades. 2 weeks ago, my very first mentor, Marie Gironda, passed away. Her high school classroom was the first time I stepped into a civic space as an educator, assuming the role of an educator, really pre-service teacher. And completing my own Master of Arts in Teaching degree at the time, I had just come out of college with a degree in African American Studies and Literature. I had attended 13 public schools before that, and lived in 18 different homes raised by a single parent who was working to get her own education. That experience, working in low income, and culturally, racially, ethnically, linguistically diverse, economically diverse neighborhoods, exposed me to a different version of how I understood myself as a white guy in college who had a different perspective on attitudes with respect to race and gender and equity. And so that work and commitment to that work sort of carved out a pathway in seeing education as this democratic civic space, a space that in my own upbringing had been a source of stability. And for the educators who took me under their wing, offered me a space in which I was valued as a learner and was prepared as an informed citizen, someone who began to question how systems and structures were designed to reach those living in poverty, those that society and the democratic values and beliefs that our country was organized around in name. How do we fulfill and meet that obligation? And so in thinking about our panel today, I have let's see, I have a few slides for you that echo some of the work that we do as I partner with school districts, working with school teachers, counselors, working with school principals and superintendents, district leaders. The work that we're doing in thinking about how we work to advance equity in schools really is part of our thinking and obligation to thinking about education in schools, colleges, organizations as civic spaces, not just spaces where democratic values are discussed, places where democracy is rehearsed, reinforced, or undermined by everyday practices of teachers, school leaders, and certainly students and families that choose to make different decisions that undermine democratic life. This idea of collective life for this series shows up in how disagreement, in my mind, has been handled, specifically with respect to the wave of anti-DEI measures that took place after summer protests in 2020. The way in which we think about disagreement, how authority is exercised, and whether people are treated as thinkers, capable of inquiry, or as problems to be managed. When dissent or discomfort is misread as resistance, fragility, moral failure, institutions end up reproducing hierarchy in the name of inclusion. And so what my work at the center has shown, working alongside school leaders and teachers, especially in moments when classrooms or organizations are unravel in response to a racist incident or crisis, is that these breakdowns are rarely the result of lack of commitment by the teachers or school leaders to create safe, democratic, and respectful spaces, civic spaces for their students. It is more often that these mistakes, these failures are instructional and organizational design failures. They're failures where people lack shared norms for inquiry, reflection, meaning making, conflict escalates, and democratic capacity erodes. And so it's my perspective that I think in this conversation with respect to the intersection of healthy democracies and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is that healthy democracies depend on institutions that know how to help people learn with one another under conditions of tension, not avoid the tension or weaponize the tension when it plays out in our classrooms. This conversation, I think, is urgent because we are living through a moment in which institutional missteps are being amplified and politicized in ways that threaten democratic education itself. Across higher education and K-12 schools, poorly facilitated conversations about race and identity are being held up as proof that equity work is coercive, unsafe, and intellectually weak. But those moments, in my opinion, aren't evidence that DEI is failing. They are evidence that institutions have not adequately prepared educators to do this work well. When discomfort is treated as a goal by a professor, an instructor, or a school leader, rather than a signal for reflection, when identity is used as an explanation instead of a lens, and when dissent is pathologized instead of examined, learning collapses. And when learning collapses, critics don't need to invent narratives. We're handing them the evidence. These are some of the ways that I've seen different missteps happen in K-12 and schools, K-12 schools and colleges and universities. I've seen myself and colleagues learn from mistakes like positioning ourselves as moral authorities rather than facilitators of adult learning. I see us treating students as recipients of knowledge despite our social justice commitments, rather than divergent thinkers capable of disagreement. And I often see us in moments of crisis reasserting hierarchy when we treat our colleagues and our students' dissent as resistance to us and their discomfort as evidence of their ignorance or evidence that they might be learning just because they're uncomfortable with the question we ask them in class. And so this sort of central idea that we don't think of ourselves as adult learners is something that carries me into my perspective on democracy and how we see ourselves participating in it. Okay. Talking about DEI is not the same as teaching it. When discomfort is treated as a goal, when identity is used as an explanation instead of a lens, when dissent is pathologized, identity categories are used as explanations rather than understanding them as perspective. Come forward, a little behind. Okay. All right. And so I think that reimagining democracy right now means redesigning schools and organizations so they can hold complexity, disagreement, and growth without imploding under pressure. What makes this conversation different today, I think, is that it shifts the focus away from moral positioning toward institutional responsibility. Rather than asking whether educators are committed to democracy and inclusion, I'm asking what I think is a harder and more useful question. Are our schools and organizations actually designed to support democratic learning, especially under stress? Too often, faculty and our school leaders are asked to navigate these emotionally charged, high-stakes conversations without preparation in adult learning facilitation or developmental design. And the result is a predictable cycle of avoidance, overcorrection, and public backlash. And I wonder how the educators I work with and those in this room think about how we create spaces to examine these everyday rituals, conflict, care, decision-making, learning. How we can sometimes reproduce hierarchy and and instead how we might think of those as opportunities for democratic transformation. And so my final slide, I'll wrap up here. Click here. There we go. I think democracy is practiced in how we handle disagreement. I think that treating dissent as a basis for inquiry, not as defiance, scaffolding reflection in these moments are important to connect the emotions that come up in difficult conversations. And I would want us to consider to what extent democracy, we might be thinking of democracy as failing, not because of bad ideas or bad actors. For students here today, I hope that these ideas affirm your role as co-creators of collective life, not passive recipients of institutional decisions. This afternoon, I was sitting on the dental chair. It was painful. It was just a cleaning. Everything's great, no cavities. As I was going through the cleaning, the dentist was offering me a lot of care. She was attending to whether I was okay. She was asking me questions. And then after the cleaning, she stepped out, and there was 4 or 5 minutes, maybe longer, where I had been left lying on the chair. There was no one coming in. I was just laying there, floating, lying down. And I thought about the discomfort of those previous 10 minutes or so, and the opportunity to lay there floating as if I was floating in the air and paying attention to what was happening in my body, reflecting on what was coming up for me, why was it so painful and uncomfortable, and how was I going to move through this moment. And when they came back in, when the hygienist came back in to do the cleaning of my teeth, I was way less stressed about this next process, despite all the noise and the experience of someone cleaning your teeth for you with the instruments you're not familiar with. I think this vignette is important to thinking about what does it mean to attend to the environment we are creating with our colleagues, with people in board meetings, our fellow community members, family members we disagree with. What does it mean to attend to the learning environment or in adult learning literature what they call the holding environment, the container that surrounds us in the room as we think about turning up the heat and engaging in some productive disagreement, and then realizing we might need that moment where the dentist walks out of the room and we take a reflective pause and slow down and think about how we're productively engaging the person, the people in front of us, and recognizing that that entire experience is representative of how we embrace, engage in democracy. So I'm sorry if I went a little bit over time. I just want to leave you with the idea that we can't build otherwise without building our capacity. We have to see ourselves as learners and builders, not just advocates and defenders of democracy, diversity, equity, inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Three quick things. First of all, I think the work that both of you are doing is critical, and especially under present circumstances, I hope that it keeps up. I have to say that I was in the dentist chair this morning, and no one let me float. They just went right to it. Secondly, I have terrible spring allergies, so if I start coughing like crazy, I'll take a glass of water and keep going. And thirdly, I don't have slides because I'm not because I'm a technophobe, although I kind of am, but because that's not how I teach, and that's not how I communicate with people. It's just probably a generational difference. It was right after Donald Trump's first election in 2016 that Amber Miller, then the dean of USC Dornsife, called me and said, I want you to, you don't have to do this, but I would like you to rename, redefine, and enlarge the scope of what was then called the Unruh Institute, which is now part of the Center for the Political Future. And I spent a large part of Christmas vacation doing that. I went out, and this is unique among institutes of politics in America, recruited Mike Murphy, a conservative, as co-director, and set about trying, and I was intrigued by what you said at the beginning about universities are not self-contained. They have to be out there. Mm-hmm. They have an impact on the world. And Amber Miller's phrase for it was the academy in the public square. Mm-hmm. And that's what we wanted to be. And our aim is to address the urgent challenge of polarization that faces the country. I'd like to have a politics where we respect each other, we respect the truth. I don't think we can do that by ourselves, but we can model it and we can try and advance it. And that's what we've done. So that if you lose the game, you don't burn down the stadium, which is sometimes where I think we're at. We do this, we do this in a number of ways. First, we have a lot of programming that not only reaches students, but involves public engagement. Bipartisan public programming that brings leaders from across the political spectrum to campus, panel discussions, public forums, issue-focused events featuring elected officials. We've sponsored gubernatorial debates, mayoral debates, and in all of those, we've tried to involve students. We're very student-centric as well, and I'll get to that in a moment. Some of the people, just to give you a sense, that we brought to campus and that students have been able to engage with: Nancy Pelosi, Pete Buttigieg, James Carville. On the Republican side, Mark Meadows, Christine Todd Whitman, Reince Priebus, and the list goes on and on. Simone Sanders, Donna Brazile. I mean, it's just a very wide range of people. One of the things we do is our annual Warsaw Conference on Practical Politics. And unlike the one that was held in 2020, after the 2020 election, at Harvard, we didn't have people throwing rolls at each other. We actually had them listening to each other and talking about, from their perspective, what they thought happened. And it's been fun. It's been a challenge. And, you know, you have to win the trust of people. You have to convince a Reince Priebus, for example, that, yeah, I'm a Democrat. And, Murphy may be a conservative, but not a big fan of Trump's. But we're going to play it fair. We're going to play it down the middle. We also do a Climate Forward conference in association with Wrigley every year. We do a Young Women's Leadership Conference. And we've done specialized forums on democratic trust, anti-Semitism, civic participation. We also believe in partnership. So if you guys ever want to do something with us, you just let us know. Because I worry that universities too often are siloed and that they're missing a lot because they're not in the process of cross-fertilizing one another. We also have a very robust fellows program where we bring leading political operatives, former office holders to campus, and they teach a 4 or 10-week study group. In many cases, they become mentors or advisors to the students, and they help them find their career paths. By the way, when I said that we believed in the Academy and the public square, we have a podcast that has 180,000 subscribers. And we broadcast our events on Facebook Live, on Zoom. So we have thousands, tens of thousands of people involved in these events every year, and it just keeps growing. The kinds of people, I mean, look, many of you may not have heard of Jim DeBoo, okay? He's a big advisor to Gavin Newsom. He was a fellow last semester, and students benefited immensely from being able to talk to him about Proposition 50 and what was going on with redistricting. That kind of thing you can't get anywhere else. I mean, you can get stuff in a classroom, but when you combine it with real-world experience, you're creating a much richer playing field. The other thing we do is, and this is because of a legacy gift that was left to us years ago, we give about $150,000 away in summer scholarships so that students who otherwise could not afford to take an internship can go to Washington, go to Sacramento, or do it here. I feel very strongly about this because when I was in school, I wouldn't have been able to afford to do it unless there had been something like that. So we were, and by the way, the other day, for example, we brought Jonathan Turley here, who, a professor of law at GW, big defender of Donald Trump's, and he filled a room for people wanted to talk to him, wanted to hear what he had to say. So we, as I said, we're not going to change the world ourselves, but we're going to help to change it. And we have a fraction of the budget of the Harvard Institute of Politics, which was funded by the Kennedy family in 1964, I think to the tune of $10 million. And then Harvard invested that money ever since. So you can imagine how much money it is now. Nonetheless, we do as many events. We manage to reach an awful lot of people. And I think we are on the West Coast, some critics might call it the left coast, but we are on the West Coast, the leading center for this kind of democracy work, which is different from what you two do, but which I think complements what you do. So I'll shut up so you guys can ask questions.
Thank you, Bob. Wonderful. Thank you, Mindy, John, and Bob. What I'd like to do now is maybe offer a question to each of you, maybe kind of go back to the beginning and start with Mindy, and then I'll ask, oh, by the way, timing-wise, you consummate professionals. We are right on time. Thank you. So I want to ask then maybe an open question or two that all of you can answer, and then we're really looking forward to opening it up. So again, kind of be thinking about some questions that you would like to ask. But I'll start with Mindy. Mindy, thank you. And clearly, your work in generating important research, providing data tools is robust and profound. And you talked about really being committed to inclusivity, accessibility, nonpartisanship. And I'm just wondering, who could argue with that? Where are the challenges that you face? Where is the resistance, or maybe what are some of the obstacles, and what does that tell you about your work, and maybe tell you about what you need to do going forward?
That's a good question. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, I lost you. Before I answer, I just want to recognize Eleanor Love, who's in the audience, who's been a long time intern and a staff member and participant in so many different ways at the Center for Inclusive Democracy, going back for when she was in high school. So, so grateful for all of your contributions, Eleanor. And I should have mentioned a moment ago, too, when I was talking about why we founded the center and why it exists to begin with. It is very much this sense of responsibility that we believe, an underlying kind of foundational piece is that the academy should be conducting research that doesn't just answer real world questions, that's important, but also is paying particularly attention in our field to questions of inclusivity, but also accessibility in terms of being able to understand it, to work through it, to produce products, research products that are actually usable, right, for communities. And that we have a sense of, deep sense of responsibility, particularly for communities that have historically been underrepresented, not part of the academy as much, and also very much so often left out of research or left out of the dissemination and the conversation around research, right? So that's the foundational reason why start this center, because we have a responsibility to do so, right? And personally, I felt a responsibility, obviously. I didn't talk about my background, but obviously. So to answer your question, though, I won't talk about the resistance part, at least right now, at least initially, but just what are the challenges? I think when people see research centers especially at a major university, most people I think they're all kind of equal. Maybe some are bigger, they have more funding, more staff, some are smaller, but they're all part of that university, and right, they all have maybe the same amount of support and life, not lifeline, life course, right, in terms of what they're going to be doing. But that's not the case, right? So there are centers that really matters. Well, of course, funding is always a big deal, right, externally and internally. But also centers sometimes are often started by deans or by faculty committees, or a long process, right, to build something that they believe fills a gap or a need, and that's important. You have centers that are often created by individual faculty because it's an extension of their research. They got a grant, right? Sometimes those centers aren't around very long. Sometimes they are, but maybe they're not as active. All good, or maybe they come up and down, right, depending on the field and what the need is or what the funding is. All good. And then you have, I think, centers that are founded in ways that are, like my center is self-funded, right? And feel much more kind of vulnerable or precarious in a large university. And I'm saying this because I think this is a real thing that we should be talking about. So whereas I've always felt really supported by USC, and I felt enormously supported at UC Davis as well, I'm not a tenured I'm not a tenured faculty member. I'm a research professor. I'm on contract. That was a choice I made way back in graduate school when I felt compelled to start a research center when everybody told me I shouldn't. But there tends to be a relationship between people who do this kind of research, people that want to give communities a voice, not want to, know that we have an obligation and responsibility to give communities a voice. You tend to be from the community, and you tend to have a background and a set of experiences that are going to make you make choices in your career that often don't take you down a tenure track. I've had no regrets about it because I feel still to this day, right, very compelled to do my work. It's my life's work. I have amazing crew and staff and team and collaborators all over the place, and we all share the same mission. How lucky am I, right, to get to do that? How fortunate are we to be able to do this sort of work? All of us in this space. But when you make those choices, the Academy doesn't do a very good job of recognizing those differing patterns. And so, you're laughing. Yes, right?
We have a lot in common.
Yeah. So the people that are going to do research, not always, present company excluded too, of course, but that are more likely looking at patterns, that are going to do research that is rooted in community, rooted in voice, and reaching out to the community, right, are going to be more likely to be people that are going to find themselves in more vulnerable, potentially vulnerable positions in the Academy, right? So if you have a research center that is self-funded by definition, right, funding up and down, that center could go. If you have people that have started or associated with that center that are not tenured faculty, right, you are more vulnerable as a center. And I think, we often talk about, or at least we certainly did up until recently, about the need to make the Academy more diverse in terms of just faculty, right? And not a lot of real conversation about why we have the lack of diversity often in so many schools and departments. And it's because we have, for instance, a national job market. You get your PhD, you're expected, you have to, for survival, to go out on the national job market. We have norms that you're not going to be viable, right, or even considered to get a PhD or a faculty position, where you got your PhD. Almost always, not going to happen. But people who want to serve their community, stay in their state, right? What do? You can't go on the national job market because you'll be leaving your community behind. Or maybe you have family and kids. I got my PhD as I was a single mom myself, right, going through school. I wasn't going to leave my state. My center was called for 8 years the California Civic Engagement Project. I'm not going to leave the state, right? So recognizing those patterns, respecting those patterns, looking for ways to support that work, I think is really critical. So I'm hoping I'm answering your question.
You are.
And then in terms of, just really quickly, the resistance. The reality in this space is it has become more difficult, right? I do a lot of media. I'm fairly well versed. People tell me in terms of, talking about the work and avoiding, potential pitfalls or people trying to pull you in pitfalls. I think media often get a bad rap. They are great partners in disseminating your research. I rarely ever had somebody in the media tried to pull me into a pitfall, but you still have to be careful. Nowadays, it's so much more difficult, but people will make assumptions and want to charge your work in a certain way. You have to, right, be very dedicated and very committed to the nonpartisan pathway, knowing that that's your role that you play. Others play other roles. That's a role that you play, right? That it's not about parties or individual candidates, but it's about the people's voice and representation, and then everybody, not just those people who are going to vote for certain candidates, that everybody, right, should participate. And you have to be deeply committed to that, and that is even more difficult in these times. And when you have a center with an I and a D, because just the word democracy, we haven't talked about this today, is stigmatized. It is. And you have an I and a D, and you're in California, maybe people might want to assume a lot of things about your work. I'm used to that, and we've navigated it surprisingly well, knock on wood. And we have relationships across the country in red and blue states, so to speak. But it is a challenge, and it does take a certain commitment, and it does take a path that sometimes also can mean that you give up other things, right, to take that path. That also mean that your center faces challenges that maybe others don't. So just to think about that, hopefully.
No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, just again, calling us back to our title today, Building Otherwise, you've given us, that's a really helpful and insightful response in terms of, you've given us clues about ways that we need to think about building otherwise in terms of how we support our centers and who we bring to campus and how all of this is structured. So thank you.
Not all centers are equal in the power structure in a university.
Yeah. So I want to move to John. John, ask you a question. And this, along these same lines of sort of thinking about how we do things differently, and you illuminate a lot of great ideas. Some of them, you're a teacher and a learner at heart, we can tell. You talk, that's who you are, and you think about this as a learning problem. And you talked about the fact that we need to rehearse democracy and reinforce it. And ultimately, it's about learning to learn together. And the importance of seeing ourselves as adult learners in this process. So my question is should we just have more PD, professional development, or professional learning around this? What is the type of learning activities that we need to do together to engage in this learning that you're calling for?
Yeah, I went for a PhD because I wanted to change teacher preparation programs. I had gone through a master's program. At that time, no one in my family had a graduate degree, and I thought about what that meant to get a graduate degree. I was living with my grandparents who had moved to a New York suburb from the Bronx, and they moved
John,
there at a time.
Hold on. Do we need a different mic? Or he's
Am I going in and
a little
out?
bit.
I can hear you.
I just worry about the online learners. Online. Sorry to interrupt.
Kanai says yes.
Okay, Kanai says good.
Thank you, Kanai.
Thanks.
They moved there in '72 at a time in which this particular suburb. Switch it? Is this better? Yes. Okay. In learning about their history of moving from the Bronx to a New Jersey suburb, eventually in living with them for 2 years, they had a profound sort of impact on my thinking about their own stories, both from being children of immigrants in New York to, my grandfather working on Madison Avenue to my grandmother working at the local real estate office. Learning about their story gave me perspective on, as I was staying with them for 2 years, driving into Newark and teaching in schools that resembled the kind of communities that I had grown up in. Not like the suburb that had some of the best funded schools in the state, some of the most beautiful parks and neighborhoods and homes, and served primarily what seemed to be people working in finance in New York and other prominent jobs in which they could afford to live there and pay the high property taxes. That perspective lent itself to the fact that I was understanding the Black arts movement and the Black power movement and the civil rights movement, and Newark as one of the epicenters in which the protests that turned into riots in Newark burnt down much of the central ward of the district that was never rebuilt. And so that gave me perspective on what I was doing in this school, how the schoolyard had been paved over so the teachers didn't have to park their cars on the street at the cost of students not having a recreational space. And this is all to provide a little bit more context of why I thought the program, an MAT program, a Master of Arts in Teaching program with a credential, that was designed to pipeline new teachers into working in underserved schools, was not as well equipped or available to work with and build our capacity as new teachers alongside us in schools. And I was at a university that was considered it was the original normal school, the original teachers college of New Jersey. And our faculty were committed and were talking, every class had a connection to social justice and work. Where I needed more at that time, and where my professors sort of pulled me aside and said, you should go on for a PhD and go into, get your doctorate and all that. And that to me was totally out of reach. But it became more and more convincing as I saw the opportunity to think about how these programs could be designed as they might have been before there were schools of education, in which the teacher educators were working alongside, and that work was valued and incentivized and rewarded in ways that offered new teachers entering the profession a more sustainable pathway to staying in it. And so to me, with respect to thinking about this work as learning, is that when I started at USC, I had been adjuncting for 6 years at this university where I had gotten my master's, and I was going to school in New York and then at McGill in Montreal. When I came to USC, I was 29. By the second year, I was working as a director of clinical experiences in holding that appointment and teaching my classes. By the fifth year, I was the chair of the program. I don't think I really had the experience to be in those leadership roles. I knew that I was committed to being in those roles, and I was working alongside committed faculty and leaders who supported me in that work. They're here in the room today as well, even though I didn't have so much experience. But I was committed to learning through that experience and doing my best to see through transforming that program, which we did in the time I was chairing. What I'm getting at is that I realized that through that process, there was a lot of learning and transformation that needed to happen. I wasn't as explicit with myself and my colleagues about that commitment to learning. And so to answer your question, no, I don't think it's more PD. I think it's a shift, a fundamental shift in our mindset to think about ourselves, with all the PhDs in the room and other high degrees, EDDs and master's degrees and all of our credentials. Do we still see ourselves as learners, or are we the expert of everything in every room we sit in? And I want to disrupt that sort of assumption. And moreover, I want to talk about and work with, as I do with school districts and community colleges and the other organizations I've worked with at the Race and Equity Center and through our teacher preparation and our leadership preparation programs. And I'll wrap up by saying this. It does mean thinking about, what do I need to change in myself? Am I learning and doing the harder work of learning and working on myself as I am working with others and inviting them into a space to do that with me? Because organizational change and reform is not going to happen without doing the individual work. And that, to me, is part of the democratic idea. We have to learn how to change ourselves in order to change organizations. We need to stop jumping to reforming structures, putting out fires, changing policies without recognizing we can change the whole damn program, but if we aren't changing ourselves and building our own capacity as educators, then what good is the curriculum? What good is the anti-racist syllabus if we haven't committed ourselves to continually thinking about and striving to be anti-racist and in our work and in our everyday interactions, and then recognizing that when we're prone to mistakes, and those mistakes are learning opportunities. And to me, that's the sign, when people acknowledge those things in their everyday work, of a thriving democracy.
Thank you, John. Thank you, and I appreciate not only your answer, and you brought it back to ourselves as learners, but also the passion that comes through. I mean, anybody that knows John can attest to that's who you are, so I appreciate that. Bob, I'd love to go back to your notion of the academy and the public sphere. And it's so fascinating to hear about your work and the work you're doing through the center in terms of putting together curated programs, bringing in people from the left and the right, promoting ways to help us learn with each other and learn from each other, and then the partnerships that you're doing. And you mentioned that universities are inherently siloed, and that's an obstacle to their greater functioning in this area. And I'm just wondering, based on your work in advancing this new kind of politics, as you say, what else should we be doing in the university writ large, in classrooms, how we organize ourselves, how we behave, to help us move more toward the new kind of politics that your center is doing, if that.
Yeah, first of all, if I can say this, and it's not an answer to your question.
Okay.
Listening to you, Lincoln came to the presidency after one little noted term in Congress. So my guess is that you were probably a pretty damn good choice for those leadership roles when you were 29 and 34 or whatever it was.
That's great.
And Mindy, obviously, incredibly entrepreneurial about doing these things. I think universities need, and it's what we're trying to do, to provide experiential learning as well as pure academic learning. I wouldn't dispense with one or the other. I think they're complementary. Mm-hmm. I incredibly lament the fact that we don't teach civics in high school anymore, as far as I can tell from my students, and I have really smart students. And American history seems to have stopped at the end of World War II because a lot of these places don't want to deal with McCarthyism and the Red Scare and Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. So I think you got to do two things. You got to give people a sense of the society in which they live. You've got to give them the chance for experiential learning, for immersion, for contact with people who are doing the kind of work that they're reading about, but that the people who are out there doing it. And I can't emphasize enough how important this principle of learning is. If I had to define it differently than I did in my opening, I'd say, yeah, we're a learning center at the Center for the Political Future, because not everybody is right all the time. And you can actually listen to people that you think are completely wrong, and you might say, well, actually, that's a point I need to think about. And I think we need to do that across the university, in classrooms. Teddy Kennedy once told me a story about his brother, JFK, saying to him, if you ever sit in this position, that is in the presidency, you have to have 3 or 4 people around who are allowed to tell you when you're being a dumb SOB, and you have to reward them, not punish them. And at a certain level, leaving aside the SOB, that's what universities need to be doing. And they need to encourage that kind of interchange among people and that kind of debate. And it can be respectful debate. You don't have to hate the other person just because you disagree with them. The funny thing is, one of the things that's happened at the Congress is they all arrive on Tuesday morning now and they leave on Thursday night. And they don't get to know each other. And in the polarized world that we live in, if today a Ted Kennedy went to Orrin Hatch and said, look, I got this idea to, Clinton Care has failed, to ensure all 8 million poor kids in America, or 8 million poor kids in America, will you co-sponsor it with me and we can pass it? Hatch wouldn't say, which he did then, well, it's got to be a state component, Ted, it can't just be federal. Kennedy said, I'll work that out. He'd say, I can't do that, I'll lose my primary. So these folks don't work together. And it's funny, they're better at working together in the context of coming to the center and debating each other and talking with each other than they are necessarily in their day jobs representing the United States.
That's great. Thank you, Bob. I want to open it up momentarily here to questions from the audience, but I do have one more question, just a general one, and one of you or all of you can answer it. But we've talked a lot about what we need to do differently and how this is going to move us toward preparing for a more flourishing democracy. But I just want to ask, have you seen instances when honest dialogue around race, truth, other differences is done and is working well? What have you seen in terms of outcomes among individuals or groups or changed perspectives, different kinds of practices? You could just be a quick example too.
Acknowledgement of competing commitments and recognizing that, living with that, and recognizing there are ways in which you might be committed to social justice and racial justice, but you also might think you've read a few books about it and are not actively doing something about it in your everyday life. Or you might make a mistake and say, well, I've read that, or I know that, instead of saying, well, maybe I should have known better, and maybe there's a way I can do better. So Robert Kagan and Lisa Leahy's work out of Harvard, they have a book called Immunity to Change. They're educational psychologists. And they have a framework that they use for both individuals and organizations. And the Immunity to Change framework looks at, what do I say my espoused commitments are? And then what am I doing and not doing that's undermining those commitments? Having conversations with people across parties and politics and values and beliefs often can surface exactly what those ideals or those values or what you think your commitments are, without inviting further introspection as to what you're doing or not doing in your everyday life that is undermining that. I can be, drive an electric car and at the same time, it be run by a person that I completely don't like, that has done things that makes me want
I
to
wonder who that would be.
trash the car. And still every day I'm driving and I'm thinking, this is an amazing technology that has happened. And also the person running the company, the politics don't align with mine. And then I recognize in history, we've owned several Fords, in my family. Henry Ford was known anti-Semite, right? Learning that and then recognizing what decisions do I make at what point and how does that undermine my own commitment and values? And then how can I do better? Because a lot of times we have big assumptions that are holding us in place. It's not that we're just holding assumptions. It's that the big assumptions are if we do certain things, people are going to retaliate. The conversation is going to fall apart. People are going to melt down. And the point that I was making earlier is that we're not often thinking of each other as fellow learners in the conversation and stepping into the role of what does it mean to facilitate with divergent thinkers in ways that means non-resolution and being okay with everyone having competing commitments out on the table.
Well, I want to say one quick thing
Yeah.
about this. I don't want to be a Pollyanna,
Yeah.
or us to be a Pollyanna about this. This is a really tough time to do what you're doing. And that makes it all the more important, because right now we are taking museums, national monuments, things like that,
Yeah.
and we are stripping the learning away from them. Now, somebody's got to substitute for that. And it seems to me the best substitute available, although, of course, then that you get your research funding threatened maybe, but the best substitute available is the university. And showing people both sides of the issue, letting them debate both sides of the issue, but letting them learn what happened in American history and the impact that it has today.
I'll add a little bit there
Yeah.
too. So just thinking about at the university level, the university's role, so when I heard you ask that question, I think about what can universities, including our own, right, do they need to do to encourage free expression, freedom of speech, dialogue that is respectful, and so forth. So we know that universities, the academy, is an absolutely critical pillar of almost any type of democracy, including the American version of democracy. It is foundational. And we've gotten a lot of slack or a lot of criticisms in recent years from lots of different places, actually, to say that the academy is not doing that great of a job at encouraging free speech, that people feel like they're marginalized, they can't speak up. And really, I would say that from lots of different perspectives, not just one side or the other. And first off, I want to give the universities credit that when we can compare ourselves to other segments of society, we actually do a lot better than other segments of society, right? We do encourage conversation and dialogue, but not always very well. And there has been, as I'm sure everybody here knows, a movement afoot, right, especially in the last year, where more and more universities have announced and have started or expanded initiatives aimed at free expression, pluralism, freedom of speech, open dialogue initiative here or project here on campus. Of course, just to give Bob credit and Center for Political Future, you guys have been doing this for a long time here on campus as well, right? Which is fantastic, is a huge base, right, to expand on. But I think we have to make sure that we're holding all of those initiatives accountable. Because when you launch a new initiative anywhere, right, you expand an initiative, there's expectations with that, right? You're asking students to come in and to trust. You're asking faculty, right, or staff, or however large or wide it is. And what we can see, the initiatives that seem to be more successful, and I say more successful meaning there's more dialogue, more open, more respectful conversation, students feel more prepared, right, for the world beyond the academy, as this is a critical part of their preparation, right, to serve the world and to be a place in it, be part of it. But the ones that are more successful are the ones that, are interdisciplinary, multiple perspectives wherever possible, right? Where there is as much as possible student-driven, right? So it isn't like imposed on them, certainly built into classrooms, but student-driven or group-driven, and that there's training for faculty, right? You can start an initiative, but you have to make sure that those faculty actually feel comfortable and safe, especially in this environment with, classrooms being recorded and all those, like, many faculty themselves have felt, there's lots of survey data that say this, especially in the last couple of years, where faculty across the country have said that they feel often themselves they are self-censoring because they're nervous in the classroom, right? Or they're nervous about their administration, lots of different reasons too. So acknowledging that faculty and others that are engaging with students and the student organizations that are engaging with students need to have training and support, know where they're, I would argue, where they're bound, if there are boundaries, that's kind of a bad word, but how far can they take it? A lot of times the uncertainty leads to self-censorship, right? Because people don't know, well, I heard we could do this, but I'm not quite sure what happens if it blows up. What does this mean for me? So training and support resources really matter. And then lastly, I'll just say, measurement and accountability, like with anything. Universities can do this sometimes really well and often not so well, just in whatever topic we're talking about. But measuring what does success look like, right? We don't want anything to be performative, right? It has to be real. What does success look like? What is the accountability around that? How do we learn from it? Understanding that it's going to be iterative, if you will. It's going to, there's going to be, stops and starts, right? That's okay. But where's the accountability? What's the learning, at least at administrative level, and those that are engaging with students? I think all of that's really important. And then lastly, dare I say, I think that because we've had so much conversation in the last year, and for many folks, I think there's, at least in the press, we've often seen it kind of being framed as a response to maybe the political landscape that we see right now. And I think that's dangerous, right? Because we should have, it's always been a pillar of the academy to have free expression and freedom of speech, right? Again, seen more successfully in other places. This is something we should be doing. I argue no school should be doing it because of the political environment. But we should be watching out for assumptions around that could undermine the success of it, right? It should be because this is our responsibility, right? So just kind of, maybe that's part of the accountability part of it, right? To always make sure that it's not performative, that it is actually, we're doing what we say we're doing, and we're doing it for the right reasons, because students will sniff that out too, right? And faculty will, and so forth. So anyway, those are my last
Great.
thoughts.
Thank you. Awesome. What are you all thinking? What are you curious about? What has piqued your interest? And we have a mic for you. And if you could just say your name.
Fred Atkinson. We're all brick and mortar people, all right? To establish a visual, the pie graph can only have so many quadrants. We are looking at our element in that pie graph and not worrying about the other guy, all right? We are growing, the other guy is decreasing. But we think because the other guy is on Wall Street and in DC, and there's a political factor out there, we have to worry about them. We don't have to worry about anybody except ourselves. Like Roosevelt said, the only thing you need to fear is fear itself. So as a small cohort that has tremendous mental capacities, don't worry. Just act and do, and follow and ask questions that energizes us to get a good night's sleep and to get up early in the morning and jump on the computer, but not stay on it. Go outside and walk around. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Another question?
Thank you so much, everyone. Bob, I'm curious if you could reflect on the role of technology. You know, we've seen such and specifically in terms of how we are more and more isolated. So I know, I mean, I feel it, and, you know, as a 54-year-old person, like that's my generation, I feel it, a big shift in the younger generation and how they're getting to know each other, how open their minds are. In some cases, like super open and really inquisitive, and in others, like really stuck in their algorithm. So I just would be curious to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, I actually teach about this. I think that we still have not even begun to deal with the impacts of technology on society and democracy. We used to have a common base of knowledge. In 1962, if someone had gone to Walter Cronkite, if any of you remember who he is or was, sort of America's newscaster, and said, you know, there's this group called the John Birch Society, and they're holding a press conference today to say that President Eisenhower was an agent of the communist conspiracy and President Kennedy's a socialist. How many cameras do you want me to send? And he would have looked up and said, you're fired. We had gatekeepers. So that when Kennedy and Nixon are debating Medicare in 1960, Nixon doesn't say, well, there are no elderly people going medically bankrupt. I mean, he deals with the facts. He says, I have a different plan that I would like to institute. At one level, technology has actually helped to democratize politics in the sense that, I think we spent in the general election in the Kerry campaign about $84 million. So we were under federal funding. These campaigns now spend $1 billion. And part of that is because this technology enables people to become participants in the campaign in the way they never were before. In 2004, I used to go down to the room where all our technology people were, and of course it wasn't developed the way it is now. And I'd say, but let me see what people are saying to us and get a sense, not from just polling or focus groups, but what they're saying to us. So it democratized fundraising. I mean, Howard Dean raised $44 million before Iowa, and John Kerry raised $250 million before the Democratic Convention. Unheard of. A huge amount of it came from this new technology, from social media. So that's the good side. I mean, it kind of balances out the people who can throw $200 million into a campaign because they make a car you don't like. But the bad side of it is that everybody is their own broadcasting station. Everybody is their own network. Everybody is their own New York Times. Everybody is their own Walter Cronkite. There are no gatekeepers. So the most ridiculous theories fly around and people believe them. I mean, what in the hell was Hillary Clinton doing in front of a congressional committee today, testifying about a man she never met, never talked to on the phone? Well, there are tons of conspiracy theories about this. So I don't think we've solved it. I don't know whether technology will solve the problems of technology or whether AI will make things even worse. It's got good sides, but it's got some real downside too.
We do have an online question from Greg Franklin. He asks, for the university, what are the most important components/agreements for an effective holding space?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently than the way it was framed. And Greg, you'll let me know online, or you'll call me afterwards, I guess. When we look at the structures of our role as faculty, are we thinking about the role of our own learning in that structure? So we might opt in to go to a conference for our own professional learning and not be presenting. That might be one venue in which we do that. But to what extent does the entire design of our experience at the university sustain spaces for us to do that learning work? And so I guess one of the ways I'll answer the question more directly is that we have to figure out what a holding environment or a holding space means with respect to our own learning and what it means to facilitate that space as an adult educator. And I think that means we have to have a better sense of the psychology of emotions and cognition, and expect that emotions that are intricately linked with cognition is that if we care about a subject matter, most likely we're going to have an emotional response in participating in the conversations. And too often we are doing things, going back to competing commitments, that undermine what we think is supposed to be a student-centered engagement or an inquiry-based approach, and we end up dictating the terms and taking up most of the airtime in our, whether we're meeting with colleagues or we're teaching one of our classes or we're meeting with a school-university partner. Most of my work in school-university partnerships requires holding a space for the people in the room to unearth what is coming up for them, not just the issue at hand or the crisis or the idea that they're going to put together a strategic plan to address all of the different opportunity gaps and that exist in their district. It is also about what are they bringing, what histories are they bringing, what relationships and what assumptions are they holding that are surfacing and getting in the way from progress happening. That means they got to engage in the individual work, and they got to be able to recognize that while they might be committed to equity, there's also a long history of institutions and structures practicing that we are the agents of reproducing in our various roles. And some of the most incredible school leaders I've worked alongside are those who constantly see their role as learning from the school leaders they're working with, the school teachers, the families, the students, and valuing their insights and perspectives as they continuously think about how the people and the organization or the district can change. And so that does require sort of shifting mindsets around how we design our organizations to sustain those kinds of experiences, learning experiences. Do we value our own learning as educators? And how do our organizations design themselves to make sure, and are we advocating for design changes that make sure that we can continuously learn and benefit from learning alongside one another as we're looking to make other forms of organizational changes? And I think that's super important, and I think we're still struggling. You know, I set out 22 years ago to get the doctorate in teacher ed, reform teacher ed, reform the program, and still see us reproducing the very structures that I experienced, 24 years ago when I started my own master's in teaching. And so there's more work to do, and we all have work to do it, and I'll stop there.
One of the ways we learn best is through conversations. So I see the food. And we'll get some food and have some conversation, but before we do that, I do want to just ask the panelists to give a final thought. Maybe it's a phrase highlighting a key thought that you talked about. Maybe it's a sentence of challenge to the group here in terms of how they should think about a takeaway from this. But let's just, whoever wants to go first, and then just a very brief kind of final rumination.
Dissent is the soul of democracy. Listening is absolutely essential to the function of democracy, and being open to other ideas than your own is fundamental to a free society.
Thank you, Bob.
Stop putting out fires. Let the fire and the flames go. Study the flames. Feel the heat. Think about it. Think about what that fire could do to potentially offer us opportunities to think about how we can change ourselves and change how we work together. Let's sit around the fire and have those disagreements. It doesn't have to result in a resolution. Why are we always jumping to resolve and avoid the discomfort, the tension, and the fire?
So we all play a role, right? It's almost a cliche to say that, but it's true. Anyone that's not participating is leaving a hole or a gap, right, in that fabric that we have to have a strong democracy, and certainly, be a strong pillar as a university. So I think challenge yourself, challenge those around you, challenge those above you, listen to those that you work with, challenge your institution, always asking, are we doing the right thing? Are we being successful? How do we know we're being successful? Are we really listening to everyone? Is everyone a part of that evaluative process and that learning process and that reimagining process? Don't believe your own press. And I mean that like just, like when you think you're doing so great and you want to celebrate it. Challenge what you think you know about the success of a given program, about the success you think of a given conversation. And always be pushing for better and to make it as obviously inclusive as well, right? In any way, shape, or form. And when it's not, then it's not real.
Thank each of you, truly. Will you join me in thanking Mindy, John, and Bob? Great. Off to the buffet.